Now, today we will be talking about feminist publications, print culture, and the business of publishing women's texts. I know this is an area that is not much researched. A lot of literature scholars, a lot of literary critics, as well as students and teachers of literature, when they're working on literature, they move straight to texts. But this is also a very, very important aspect of literature and disseminating literary text. So I think publishing is becoming more and more important for us to look at as researchers, as scholars. So I think also looking at particular kinds of print culture becomes very, very pertinent today, particularly when what we see today is a lot of propaganda texts and a lot of print material, which sort of creates a culture where what kind of texts will you read, who will read them, what kind of readership will these texts get, are all important determinant factors. So I think delving deep into the history of feminist press becomes really very, very important at this particular point in time. So I'll begin. The business of publishing all over the world has been for a long time male dominated. The history of publishing shows how women writers for centuries have had to adopt guerrilla strategies or take up a militantly, combative posture to make themselves heard. The need to create a safe and free space for women to be published had already assumed urgency by the early 20th century. Women's voices had to be brought out in the public sphere, and important works by women needed a publication platform. The feminist publication business includes publishing houses in India that specialize in women's issues, advance feminist causes, and print academic, fiction, memoir, and non-fictional works by women. The history of this business is not only inherently interesting, but of utmost importance. Recognizing and supporting women's issues. Publishing houses such as Kali for Women, Zuban, Women Unlimited, Tara Books, Tulika Books, Stree, Asmita, among others, have pushed the boundaries of publishing. They challenge the status quo and wage a continuous battle to publish cutting-edge feminist work and negotiate with the mainstream publishing industry for market share. The politics of feminist publishing and the commercial space of the marketplace exist in a sort of dynamic tension. And I want to talk about this tension in subsequently. There is a volatile dialectic between progressive politics and business profitability. However hostile, discreet, and complex the place of the market is for feminist publishers, there is no doubt that feminist publishers have influenced our understanding of patriarchy and pushed our understanding of what is feminism. And they have ushered in a movement for gender equality and provided a platform for women to speak and to be heard. So, history of the feminist press. Before we look into India's, publication history in terms of feminist publications, we need to look at the history of feminist press. And we see today that women occupy plum posts in publishing houses, call the shots and make critical decisions about what will be published and how. However, feminist publishing remains a peculiarly unacknowledged and under-examined aspect of feminist history, as I said in the beginning. But this is a history which has real effect and real influence. Now there is, as Murray insightfully remarks, an academic obliviousness to the dynamics of feminist publishing, through which an individual authorial impulse is transformed into publicly available text. Pre-publication phases are analyzed meticulously in the academia. Yet the act of making the text public, which resides at the center of literary communication circuit, remains obscured by intellectual opacity or indifference. The first attempt to open a publishing house just for women and by women was in the 19th century Victorian England. Can we go to the next slide, please? The Victoria Press was a printing press started by Emily Faithfull along with other feminist activists in London on March 26, 1860. The press, named after Queen Victoria, was created as a way to allow more women into the printing field. In 1867, management of the press was given by Faithfull to William Wilfred Head, a partner in the press. Head continued to print pieces advocating for the employment of women until 1882. Even after buying Faithfull out in 1869, Head continued to print pieces on women and women's and issues on regarding women's employment. The Victorian press, thus, can be considered as a precursor to modern feminist publishing. Despite the hostility from male-dominated London typographical society and the union, who denied women access on the grounds that they did not possess the requisite mechanical ability nor the intelligence to be typesetters, Faithfull persisted and ran her press until 1870, furiously advocating women's rights to work, gainful employment, and suffragette. It took a century for the world to see the birth of a radical feminist revolution in the field of publishing. Exactly 100 years later, Virago Press, founded by Carmen Callan in London in 1970, committed to publishing women's writings and books on feminism/feminist themes/topics, subjects, became a pioneer in the field, breaking the glass ceiling and successfully addressing unequal gender dynamics in the publishing industry. So there was a long gap before at the beginning we see a push towards feminist publishing by men, and then we see the birth of Virago in 1970, where women take over and women take charge of the publishing hub. So bolstered by a vibrant feminist, second wave feminist movement for women's liberation all around the world in the 70s, that led to the founding of Virago Press. And it is still extant. It's a publishing house that competes with mainstream publishing companies. This did make a mark in commercial publishing, along with bringing out titles that particularly advanced the feminist agenda, such as publishing original works by women and reprinting forgotten out of print texts or neglected women writers, bringing neglected women writers into print, along with those by male authors that necessarily engage with feminist themes. Other feminist publishing houses followed. So you've got Sheba Feminist Press in 1990 to 1990, a radical and innovative publishing house in the UK, was the first to publish a cookbook titled Turning the Tables, Recipes and Reflections from Women. Sheba Feminist Press was also known for publishing work that pushed the boundaries of sexuality, erotica, female pleasure, and was also interested in publishing work that tested post-imperial Britain's tryst with immigration, race, and gender relations. Let's go to the next slide. This was a first by any feminist publisher, and I'm talking about Sheba Feminist Press's first recipe book. It was not an ordinary cookbook. It was a book for ordinary women reflecting on the politics and problems of cooking and women's vexed relationship with the kitchen. And today we have cinema, we have books which talk about the politics of household work, talk about the drudgery of the work in the kitchen. But at that time, this was really radical. The book functioned as a memoir, a manifesto, and a manual. What was radical about it was that cooking and cookbooks were not usually items that would fit feminist publishing mold. But there it was, breaking down boundaries from within and letting women take over the space of the page and talk about their experiences in the kitchen and talk about food and recipes. The book brought out a feminist engagement with food, cooking, and feeding, but without ignoring the contradictions, doubts, and difficulties that marked that process. The book did not intend or pretend to please, nor was it an aspirational training manual for good wives. But indeed, it was a product of radical thinking of the women's liberation movement. So we move to the next slide, and now I come to the kind of feminist publishing we see in India. And on the slide, you see several second wave feminist revolutionary press that I have listed for all of you. And if we move on now, well, let's move on. Next slide, please. We go to feminist publishing in India, which is what I will mostly concentrate on in this talk. India's answer to Virago Press came in 1984. So in 1970, we have Virago in London, which revolutionizes feminist publishing. And in 1984, we have India's answer to Virago Press. And this was founded, and in 1984, we have the founding of the hugely influential feminist publishing house, Kali for Women. All of us who dabble with any kind of research and publishing and read feminist texts know how influential Kali for Women was and will remain. So riding on the waves of the women's rights movement of the 1980s in India, Kali for Women was founded by two equally dynamic feminist publishers, Urvashi Butalia and scholar Ritu Menon. Publisher Urvashi Butalia and scholar Ritu Menon. Arguably the first Indian publishing house dedicated to publishing on and for women, Kali for Women was started in a garage in New Delhi. Butalia and Menon came up with a small capital and a powerful idea of transforming the field of publishing in India by bringing to the fore hitherto neglected voices of women through academic publishing and activist works, translation, and fiction. And I will be using, generously quoting Menon and Butalia here. Menon says, and I quote, "We wanted to cover the entire spectrum and publish not just academic writing, but activist texts as well as fiction." This was something completely new in the trade here, and there were many who told us to be more defined. But I do believe that this was the best decision we ever made at Kali, unquote. With its first few commissioned work itself, a contributed volume on women in media, a collection of stories by women writers of India called Truth Tales, Radha Kumar's The History of Doing, and Vandana Shiva's Staying Alive, Kali straddled the entire gamut of women's writing in the subcontinent. It was academic with a focus on development, creative writing, as well as activism. Next slide, please. In an interview to Rebecca Bowers in 2018, Ritu Menon recounts the organic links that strengthened feminist publishing and activism in the 1980s. And I quote, she says in this interview, "The feminist presses were not only part of the women's movement, but what used to be called the women in the print movement. And all the women in the print movement was made up, of course, of publishers, but also of reviewers, librarians, booksellers, designers, printers, binders, and an entire support group of international network that provided not just solidarity, but also support," unquote. Shrinkala Sahai, in her article, Word-Wise Women, Early Feminist Publishing in India, points out how, and I quote, "new solidarities were being forged between feminist activists and scholars in this decade. This ushered in a fresh lease of feminist writings that were rooted in lived experiences and were seeking a language to express the socio-cultural contexts and nuances of feminism in India," unquote. Sahai discusses how, although feminist publishing in India found a formidable ally in the women's movement in the urban centers of the country, it was dismissed as trivial in content and without any market links by the mainstream publishing in India. Urvashi Butalia observes, "People were not particularly against what we were doing." I'm quoting her, but they just didn't know. They didn't understand. The English publishing world was not very hospitable to independent publishing. But because we had a track record in publishing, people were neither particularly hostile nor supportive. However, we had a huge amount of support from activists in the women's movement who saw as something that had grown out of it, unquote. Both Butalia and Menon took a deep interest in aligning print culture with feminist activism and actively sought alliances with global networks of solidarity with international feminist groups and activists within the publishing industry. As a pioneering feminist publishing house in India, Kali for Women set the tone on how feminist voices would be heard, represented, and how a feminist narrative would emerge in the country's print culture. Sahai discusses how Kali for Women's inclusion in the first International Feminist Book Fair in London in 1984 was the stepping stone for a nascent feminist print culture to emerge in India and connect with more robust movements elsewhere in the world. Menon recalls the feminist book fair in London, where feminist writers and publishers from all over the world had gathered to celebrate not only the power of the word, but also the solidarity of women in print. There was Alice Walker, Toni Kate Bambara, Alifa Rifat, Barbara Smith, Ellen Quazua, Gert Brandenburg, Suniti Nam Joshi, and Madhu Kishwar. The whole surge and potential of the international women's movement, it seemed, was there for all to see at Covent Garden, producing the knowledge and providing the perspective that would transform the world. Kali had no books, no authors, nothing to sell. But we covered our trestle table with our flyer. And the striking logo that Chandralekha had designed for us caught the attention of almost everyone who passed by. And Kali for Women's logo was really striking. I wish I had put a picture of that on the PowerPoint. So that really caught, that striking photo caught the eye of all who passed by. And this organic synergy, that was generated on that very day between feminist publishers, feminist activists, and people who were breaking new grounds became extremely and increasingly visible. Publishing is a gesture of activism, and activism fueled by publishing emerged as invitations for women and men to explore, understand, and embrace feminism as an ideology. And this synergy gave an exponential rise to books written by women, also by men who talked about challenging patriarchy. And Kali for Women started publishing really very, very important radical texts. As the booklet was distributed in workshops, training, and often on streets and shops, it was hard to miss the logo of the upcoming publishing house. And right above the logo for Kali for Women, with the fierce eyes and the third eye of the goddess, the slogan was, the slogan gave an easy invitation. And the slogan for Kali for Women was, and in their booklets, don't be afraid of feminism, join it. I move to the next section of my talk, where I talk about print culture and feminist activism. Let's move on to the next slide. Yes, so I want to just make sure that we keep the pioneers in our mind. We have Urvashi Bhuttalia and this is Ritu Menon, both extremely important in the context of feminist print culture in India. At the beginning, there were teething problems for a feminist publishing house. Low self-esteem and self-doubt made women reluctant to come up with their stories, even approach a publisher. Most of them thought that their stories are not worth, publishing. Nobody would read them. So there was always this lack of self-worth and a lot of self-doubt. The task that the publishers faced was how to convince women that they have important things to tell, and there would be a readership. Bhuttalia recollects, we tried to get women to write. At first, nobody took any notice of us, but gradually this began to change. And women came forward with their writings because when they saw that there were people interested in publishing them, they came up with the things they had been hiding for years and they had been sitting on. When you get accustomed to the habit of silence and to hiding your creativity, it is very difficult to step out and to start publishing. So along with receiving the writings that women were doing, we had to work very hard to instill confidence in these women and to tell them that what they're saying is important, worth listening to, worth reading and spreading in the world, unquote. Kali for Women published some path-breaking books, mostly in English, but also took on radical publishing in vernacular, such as the Hindi reference book Sharir Ki Jankari, about the body. Sharir Ki Jankari was published in 1989 and was written by 75 village women from Rajasthan. It was also sold by them at a special price in the village. Sharir Ki Jankari was extremely frank about sex and women's bodies and included issues such as menstrual taboos, shocking some commentators and breaking the boundaries between academic publishing and niche market and mass literature. Kali for Women acknowledged that by publishing primarily in English from Delhi, it was constrained by class, language, location. However, by publishing a radical book like Sharir Ki Jankari, it made a conscious effort to bring out the stories of the marginalized women and help them be heard. As Sahai explains, it also emerges a historical milestone where feminist solidarities between activists and print culture came to fruition at the urban-rural intersection of Indian feminism. It also raised tangential questions about the idea of a singular author figure. What happens when knowledge is from the community and to be shared with the community? And lastly, how to articulate embodied and lived knowledge in the pages of a book. In these ways, the creation and publishing of the book challenged the existing frameworks of publishing itself, offering a creative challenge for Kali for Women, and they rose to the occasion. As soon as the book was printed, the collective of women sold all the copies themselves in their villages, and 70,000 copies of the book, none sold by bookshops, all sold in rural areas by the community. This was a great achievement, and Butalia reflects. Publishing this book taught me a vital lesson. One is aware that publishing books is a limited business, since books traditionally only reach out to people who can read and write, who have the time and money to buy and read books. Here was a group of women who were illiterate writers who had produced this book, breaking stereotypes of caste, class, gender, and what is considered good writing. The book was a landmark shift, as Sahai points out in her article, that questioned, challenged, and offered alternatives to how knowledge is produced and received. With its stark simplicity and creative brilliance, it poked existing publishing strategies and proved how ingenious, alternative, innovative, and how vast the scope of emerging feminist canons could be. Committed to social change, next slide, please. Kali for Women published Radha Kumar's hugely influential The History of Doing, 1993. A pioneering attempt to record and analyze the feminist movement in India, spanning from the beginning of the 19th century to post-independence present day. Can we move to the next slide, please? Eco-feminist Vandana Shiva's landmark work, Staying Alive, that was published in 1988, which was an in-depth work on women, ecology, and survival in India. Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Vaid's landmark, Recasting Women, Essays in Colonial History, 1989. This was published by Kali for Women. And this collection argued for the feminist scholarship to revisit colonial history through the lens of gender. It attempted to bring out women's histories that had remained unheard or even noticed. And the substantially, marginalized were brought to the fore. Another important work was the English translation of Kuratulin Haidar's magnum opus, Aag Ka Darya, River of Fire. This was published in 2003. Now, these are works which are considered essential reading for an understanding of women's movement, ecofeminism, gender, and colonialism in South Asia. Another influential publication from Kali for Women was the 1986 booklet, Some Questions on Feminism and Its Relevance in South Asia, by Kamla Bhasin and Nighat Said Khan. This booklet attempted to bust some myths around feminism. Feminism was a bad word. People were afraid of feminists. They thought that feminists were bra-burning women who were out to, destroy the family structure, and these were dangerous women. So, emerging from a series of women's workshops conducted, for South Asian activists in the 1980s, this booklet attempted to define feminism in India and in the context of South Asia, and in the specific context of an awareness of women's oppression and exploitation in India, in the society, Indian society, at work, as well as in the family. And this was a conscious attempt to transform the institutions of marriage, as well as other patriarchal institutions that impinge on and oppress and exploit women and as I would say, institutions of family, for instance, imprison women in so many ways that is very difficult to break out of. But on the other hand, there was a conscious effort to make people understand that feminism is not about breaking families. Feminism is not about destroying, but it's about building new institutions. It's about bringing peace and justice to hitherto marginalized group of people simply based on gender. This booklet also took a critical position on the capitalist mode of production that had historically reinforced gender-specific roles. And the economic model of development that was followed in the 1950s, 1960s in India led to an intensification of violence on women, as well as an intensification of deprivation and degradation in the status of women. It also fielded questions like whether a housewife can be called a feminist, and how can we deal with patriarchy, how patriarchy is oppressive, not just for women, but also for men, for both genders, and why it is natural to be, why is it natural for feminism to be an uncomfortable ideology to adopt. So it explored all these, issues and these tricky spaces, and it also walked the tightrope between the personal and the political. So it made inroads into the private lives of women and connected it to the larger life of the community. So what was personal became political. The trajectory of Kali for women through the next 2 decades traced the ideological currents, the diversity, the differences, and the synergies within the feminist movement in India. It stoked the critical questioning of existing narratives within histories and the quest for a feminist canon that would capture the context of the country. It also opened up explorations that have driven feminist publishing and work culture globally across the decades. How the existing mainstream knowledge structures are being challenged by these alternative spaces that feminist publishing houses open up and create. And if the publishing industry itself has been a male bastion, what would it take to unearth these stories, challenging these grand narratives? I am now going to move to the last section of my talk, and I will talk about what happens after Kali for Women is dissolved. We know that Kali for Women addressed the need for a specific language in which women's experiences could be talked about, and how layered and polyvocal and nuanced that language had to be. Kali for Women was at the center of this transformation of urban feminism in India. And it moved from the women's question through to the women's movement and tried to achieve gender equality. At least that was the objective. That publishing these texts will in some way transform the society we live in, and it will make us, and there will be a movement towards gender equality. So what we see is Kali for Women focused on presenting women's experiences, establishing a feminist discourse that offered a way of looking at the gendered nature of our daily lives, and also politics at large and the socio-cultural contexts that shape women's lives and their experiences. After running Kali for Women for 2 decades and creating an enviable corpus of feminist titles spanning creative writing, activist tracts, scholarly texts, the door split. And we have 2 publishing houses, Butalia's Zuban Books 2004, and Women Unlimited, Women Unlimited 2004. And they both continue to publish groundbreaking work. And they uphold their commitment to feminist causes, feminist issues, challenge gender stereotypes, and enlarge the scope of the field by moving beyond India to engage with feminist writings from the subcontinent and beyond. So I will, since I don't have much time now, I will now move to the end of my talk by talking about the politics of the market, feminist publications, and the space of the market. Now, what we see is feminist publishing has expanded after Kali for Women. These expansions point out to the interesting dialectic between feminist publishing politics and the demands of the marketplace. Butalia asserts in an interview to Life Mint that with her publishing project, she wants to prove that feminist publishing can survive commercially, keeping its politics intact. And she spells out the challenges that Zuban Books faced in navigating this explosive field of feminist publishing. She says, I quote, excessive competition with the internationalization of publishing, the kind of advances the big publishers were paying, rising price of materials, heavy costs of distribution, and the need to raise salaries to maintain quality. You cannot be a feminist publisher and exploit men and women working with you. You cannot expect them to accept low salaries simply because they endorse the cause. But you have to hike salary. But if you have to hike salaries, you need to increase income. In the early days, in a market dominated by the biggies, this was difficult, unquote. So politically committed to carrying the legacy of feminist publishing forward in a commercially viable space, Zuban Books and Women Unlimited now undertake publishing translations, finding younger profile of writers. And Botalia also refers to copyright issues, acknowledging the tension that arises out of people's right to free access of knowledge and the protection of intellectual work. In her role as a publisher, she sees herself pushing for a mix of copyright and intellectual creative commons, more bookstores and books for differently abled people. What we see now is that the market space is fluid and indeterminate and hence filled with possibilities. With good marketing strategies, feminist publishers have increased their sales. This has been made possible because feminism as an ideology has been on the rise and is steadily gaining ground, especially among young people in India. More readers now show interest in feminist issues and have a deeper engagement with women's causes. There is an improvement in women's enrollment rate in higher education and a general advancement in society with regards to women's issues and causes. Movements like, the hashtag Me Too campaign against sexual harassment, the battle for LGBTQ rights leading to revoking of provisions in Section 377, films like, Pink, Lipstick Under My Burqa, Thappad, tackling women's issues such as consent, female autonomy, and domestic violence in the mainstream have also given a fillip to change in the mindset. So there is a consciousness raising movement all around us, and more people are joining as activists, fighting and rebelling against centuries of patriarchy and male entitlement that circumscribe women's lives. There are many others in India who are actively fighting state repression and armed conflict and political violence from a feminist point of view. So we are certainly witnessing a charged environment for the advancement of feminist praxis and politics, not just in India, but most parts of the world. So for today's feminist publishers, an uncompromising ideological commitment seems fortunately to make good business sense. In conclusion, where do we stand today in terms of feminist publishing? Expansions and interventions. So let's go to that slide. Feminist publishers in India who follow Botalia and Menon have already made a mark in the publishing industry. Works that are liberating, subversive, empowering in women's own voices have come to the fore in such publications. So you've got Stree, an imprint of Bhatkal and Sen, which publishes books on women's studies in English and Bengali. It publishes academic and fictional work in translation, as well as highlights women's issues and conditions and status of women in India. Stree has an exciting series, Theorizing Feminism, which introduces key concepts in feminist theory. And they are also the publishers of scholar and academic Devashruti Roy Chaudhury's Gender and Hierarchy in Colonial Bengal, Intercaste Interventions of Ideal Womanhood 2014, which examines intercaste identity and its ensuing effect on gender identity. With the rise of an increasingly commodified consumer culture, the conglomeration of the book industry, and more pluralized expressions of feminism, publishing is a vibrant yet conflicted industry that makes it mostly possible, but sometimes hard, to do committed political work as a publisher of women's writing. However difficult it may be to publish political work that is strictly feminist, feminist publishing has spawned several other important publishing houses who have made their mark on the Indian feminist publishing scene. Samya, Tara Books, Tulika Books, Asmita have engaged vibrantly and furiously with feminist issues, both in adult literature as well as in children's literature. This is very encouraging, not simply for the future of publishing, but for women's confidence building and social progress. These publishing houses project themselves as feminist imprint, and inspiringly, like Zuban Books and Women Unlimited, have not only survived but also remained vital and relevant by pushing the boundaries of publishing and coming up with new and exciting titles, showing their commitment to openness and diversity. Just a minute. Yes, there are also several Indian academic journals now devoted to feminism. So you've got Feminism, Feminist Politics, Women's Studies, Feminist Praxis, such as the Indian Journal of Gender Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and many others that rigorously publish articles that push the boundaries and understanding of feminism, gender, and a deeper engagement with women's issues. The vibrant feminist publishing industry in India has also inspired several important online platforms that are now engaged in bringing women's work issues and voices to the fore in the virtual space. Many feminist publishers today operate in niche and micro presses, and few others have fanned out to include a larger market. So to end, feminist publications are a significant aspect of feminist print culture and activism. The feminist publishing houses expose the biases of literary tradition by publishing critical work or on canon formation, and also reveal the limitations and exclusions of the canon, while expanding its boundaries to include more women writers. By publishing groundbreaking work, bringing silent voices to the fore, tearing down the veil of taboo, translating regional literature by women, expanding the area of feminist activism by moving beyond India to include South Asia, South and West Asia. These publishers have generated significant amount of attention around women's issues and women's struggle for gender justice and equal rights. They have to be credited for having given us the texts that have touched numerous lives and changed many. Armed with the courage to go where there was no money, these publishers have provided a forum for women writers to speak up, speak out, and advocate for women's issues to be taken seriously. Feminist publishing helps us discover our own voices and amplify those that have been historically silenced. It helps women to understand their world better and provides men with the tools to see the world through a feminist lens. Feminist publishing is good for all of us. Feminist publishing is here to stay. Thank you so much.